Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our webinar and information session, Capturing Knowledge from Your Retiring Workforce. So it's 2016. The big boomer retirement is upon us and it's in full force. The worry that we're seeing in companies that we're losing our best people and their knowledge and wisdom as they walk out the door. To replace those boomers are the millennials. Are they really, though? The millennials are a pretty finicky bunch and expecting a lot more from their work experience, ideally one that does not interfere with their leisure time, or so the rumors go. So much so that, though, they are not willing to stick around unless it's the right fit for them in their careers and their jobs. We are seeing that trend for sure throughout the workforce. Median tenure for a millennial today is currently around 3 years. So that tells you something big right there, and that's coming from the U.S. Department of Labor. So what I'm afraid of is that we're in the thick of this retirement of the boomers. The boomers retire, the millennials figure it all, as they figure it all out. Apparently we're going to kind of hold all this together with duct tape in the middle generations until everything kind of comes together. So one of the questions that I have for you, does your organization have a transition plan? How are you going from the millennials and the retirements that we're seeing, from the retirements and the boomers that we're seeing to the millennials? Some other interesting stats that are on the screen here. Labor force participation rates are decreased to 65.8% in April. What that participation rate is, that's the number of people that are available or able to work in the workforce over the age of 16. So only 65.8% of those people are actually working. And that's not because they're unemployed necessarily. What that means, the most of that is these are people that are retired and are no longer eligible or no longer wanting to be working. We had a comment from another company we were working with that 50 to 60% of their engineers will retire in the next 5 to 10 years. It's a pretty staggering amount considering the size of some of these organizations and their engineering groups. And so another one we had is retaining the knowledge and wisdom will be essential to retaining their advantage. That was coming from an engineering and design company that we work with as well. So between the boomers and the millennials, it makes sense that, yes, knowledge is walking out the door, stored within people's heads. So what does all this mean? Well, primarily there's no easy answer or solution that can be applied, but there can be a plan and an approach with some tools. But whatever we do, I don't think we can depend on getting it all in an exit interview. At RKO, we're fairly pragmatic in our outlook and our approaches. So we don't feel the sky is falling with this situation, but it will cause us all some challenges in all of our organizations. I think we'll still see organizations continue to thrive. I believe it's just going to cost more to do that, to achieve the same results. So what I mean by this is, with a less experienced workforce, we're going to make mistakes. Mistakes that need to be corrected. Mistakes that our customers are not going to pay for. So therefore, as organizations, we'll have to absorb these costs. On the other hand, if our less experienced workforce takes care and diligence to avoid mistakes, it is highly likely that it's going to take longer to actually do the job, which of course has a costly impact on our productivity, which will also cost us money in the end. Also, where we're seeing the biggest impact of all of this is on professional services organizations or services groups within larger organizations. Engineering-based organizations or groups with large engineering or professional service areas will likely be the biggest hit. And we're seeing that in our own customer base pretty heavily. The agenda for today. So what we're going to do today is we're going to give you a little bit of an overview of knowledge management. We're going to talk a little bit about that, give you a level set in what that is and what that means. Capturing and managing knowledge. How do we do that with the current people we have and the future people that are coming into the organization? And maybe what are some hints or some tips or some tricks to get started in such a program? So first, a little bit about me. Not too much, though. We're 100% focused on enterprise content management, or ECM. That's what our organization, RKO, does. We do both vendor-agnostic ECM strategy consulting, and from a technology perspective, we also partner with IBM and other IBM partners to deliver what we feel are truly Tier 1 solutions. Amongst our staff and principals, we have many folks whose experience goes back to the late 1990s. That's when I started in the industry. We're a smaller group, but our experience is now approaching about a couple 100,000 hours worth of project experience. Our number one priority and driving mission is to create what we call elated end users. The idea here being that ECM solutions only drive value and benefit if they're used, and they're only used if users see personal benefit in their jobs from using them. Reaching this state tends to make users elated. So how does all this relate to retiring workforce and knowledge management? Well, oftentimes these enterprise content management and records management systems are the end repository for much of this content and information. And so it's only one part of the overall solution, but that's what we're going to explore today. And of course, RKO has a lot of experience with controlled document management systems, VERSAFILE critical content being our core solution around that area. So let's start with knowledge. And let's level set what we mean by knowledge management and how that may fit into a repository. Many of you may already be familiar with this, but it starts with data. And data could be anything, literally ones and zeros, rows and columns, a word processing document, PDF, piece of paper, really, though it's meaningless without some basic context. Context can be as simple as a descriptive title, but more commonly now metadata or a subject or a classification. By adding context, we now have information, something useful and meaningful, something that could add value to an organization or a person, something that we would call information now. So the problem with information is we have so much of it. Some would argue too much, and we may even have information overload, and frankly we're just at the tip of the iceberg as the Internet of Things grows. The amount of information we receive is going to continue to grow, and so-called knowledge is going to grow at a pace we cannot keep up with. So for example, I was meeting with a manufacturer recently, and they've got information coming from almost every component of their machines, from brakes to batteries. So if you could imagine all that information coming to you from thousands of machines across the globe every day, what do you do with all of that? What do you do with all that information? And is it knowledge or not? Well, if we start to add people, or we start to add some sort of cognitive analysis into the mix, be it machine or people, that starts to generate what I think is knowledge and have it increase the value of an organization. So information is great, but it's really when you add people and cognitive analysis into the systems when you start to get some knowledge, something you can do something with and create some value with. We have two types of knowledge. The first and the easiest to wrap our heads around is explicit knowledge. So this is the knowledge that can be recorded, can be documented, can be structured, can be easily communicated, and people can be trained on it. It can be easily referenced and used and maintained, updated, and then passed on from boomer to millennial and all the generations in between. But here's the catch. I can document my processes and I can have solid manuals. I can probably find a way to get hold of my competitors' explicit knowledge, but will I be able to replicate it and create the same magic as the industry leader? Probably not. That intuition, that acumen that companies or individuals can't replicate by just reading a manual or implementing a process is what we call tacit knowledge. It comes from doing it, making the mistakes, having successes and learning from it. It's the tips and tricks. It's the intuition on how to handle each situation without a manual. It is the companies that seem to continuously pump out innovation after innovation. And you ask yourself, how do they do that? Well, it's that tacit knowledge along with explicit knowledge combined. And continuing to grow with more and more experience within the company, it eventually becomes wisdom. So the top people in our organizations, the people who seem to kill it every time, services organizations, this is the person everybody wants on their team. So more than just book smart, they bring tacit knowledge to their work every day in the projects that they do and the decisions that they make. This is a competitive advantage for organizations. And so I see this in the services industry. Some companies just seem to always be innovating and providing unique value, while others just produce cookie-cutter results. So in our opinion, this is kind of what knowledge management looks like. It's not just a document or piece of information sitting in a repository. It's combined with people. There's some process around it. And then, of course, there is some technology that holds the information. Capturing knowledge and personal IP from retirees in knowledge management is not a single one-off project, but more of a larger program that may already be existing that we just don't consider it as part of that at this point. So because knowledge management needs to be in context and captured in the moment, at least that's our feel or our opinion about it, it has to be part of a bigger related program that is dealing with this type of subject matter expertise already. So in this diagram, we see the general components of a QA program. It could be a safety program, it could be a compliance program, it could be a records management program, and integrated in this overall shape or form. We feel knowledge management should be another component in this program wheel, and would kind of look like this. So in this diagram, we expand the integrated circle to include a knowledge management component. This approach gets us out of seeing this as a one-off, fix the problem project, and more of a framework for continuous capture and improvement, even beyond our current retirement crisis. So how do we get started on something like this? So in our experience, these types of programs, they're not rocket science. They just take a lot of common sense and elements of programs that already exist. So our approach to this, though, is we start what's called a master plan center. And this doesn't have to be a big program. This could be simply one or two people, but just structuring their information in this sort of a framework. Our master plan center is basically informed by your best people or some of your best people eventually, capturing some of this knowledge and information in the moment that it's happening, and we'll talk about that a little bit in the next few slides, and then putting some structure around the capture and also capturing the structured sources of information. So our knowledge center, our center of excellence, really consists of 5 components. We need some people on the team. It might be a small team, it could be large for larger organizations, but it's just fine to be small, at least that gets started. We'll need a little bit of infrastructure, so we do need some place to store the information. We need some standards so that we're collecting, especially as our teams get larger, that we're collecting information and we're categorizing it and labeling it in a similar manner. And of course, we need some materials to help us gather this information. Once we've got that information in the system to do that, then we'll just want a little bit of light governance around that to make sure that we continue to do it consistently. So I'm not going to go into each of these in too much detail, but just to give you a quick example of some of the approaches that we've taken in the past, just kind of looking at your team. So of course, you have to have some level of executive sponsorship or some sort of management sponsorship that recognizes the problem and that you want to do something about it. Ideally, you'd have people from the program that you want to attach to. So if it's an HR program or a quality assurance program, you want to attach yourself to that program if you're not already a part of that program to implement this type of a concept. In addition to having some people on your team, you do need to have some sort of infrastructure. Primarily is having some sort of a document management repository. All these other items on the list are nice to haves, I think, and can help capture information, but are not necessarily immediate requirements. And as you see, as the list gets down towards the base, the technology becomes more sophisticated. So we get into things like cognitive content analytics. Because we do have tons of information. Remember, in our knowledge management diagram, we've got loads of information within our repositories and file shares and SharePoint, etc. How do we extract some of the knowledge out of that when we need it? Well, some of the more advanced cognitive content analytics and enterprise search engines will allow us to do that, automatically building out facets that can help us filter through information and find a nugget of knowledge that will help us either do our job or make a decision. Standards. So how do we want to collect this information? How do we want to name it? How do we want to manage it? Really is what that's about. And then materials. How do we want to present it? How do we want to inform people about this program and why it's important? And what are some maybe mechanisms for us to gather that information that we can repurpose and reuse over and over again? And then of course from a governance standpoint, really, let's not reinvent the wheel here. There's governance programs and committees already in your organization. We can just tag onto that as part of this so that it's not a big deal, and really just provide a program of continuous improvement around this. So that's our knowledge management master plan and a kind of a I guess, a go-to-market approach for people within their organization on how they can structure the program or the information. So in this diagram, what we're going to talk about is really how do we capture information from retirees or even from millennials or for anyone who's leaving the organization for that matter. One of our key tenets is that we want to be able to capture information in context. So why capturing information in a series of exit interviews doesn't work is because you're not capturing it in the moment or while it's in context to people. So we want to try and capture this information, some of their knowledge, while they're doing it. Maybe while they're involved in a procedural review. Maybe when they're being asked how-to questions. Maybe there's some roundtables or some lunch and learns that go on, and that's the moment to capture this information. It's kind of got to be embedded and hidden into their daily work in order for, I think, this to be the most effective and the least burdensome. So here's some examples of where we see organizations starting to collect some of this knowledge from the boomers and from other people in the organization. So we can talk about the different, we'll talk about a few of these, but first let me explain the chart a bit more. So the sources of information that we have typically lie in something that's very structured. So for example, a set of policies or a work instruction or something like that. Frankly, that's some knowledge and information that we have that has gotten there from people's experience and from other standards. But it can also be very unstructured. So there's, in the moment, questions that may get asked from somebody who, from an apprentice who is following or working along with one of the more senior staff. So there's these opportunities where information is very unstructured, where you may want to also start to look for grabbing that information. And of course, in the bottom axis, our methods for doing this range from being very formal to informal. So of course, you know, if we're going to capture and manage and maintain knowledge in a work instruction or a set of procedures, or from audit files, that process can be very structured but very formal as well. And we'll talk, and frankly, that's where RKO's products and solutions come into play, and where we work best is in those areas with our critical content solution. And then going from into informal, there's lots of easily available tools today, simplest being email, or little mini forums that can be submitted, or even just you know, instant messaging or insertions into a wiki. All of these things can be very informal and easy to use for boomers and millennials and everybody in between. And so that also allows us to capture some great nuggets of information in context in the moment of somebody doing something. And so what we're talking about here are really the tips and the tricks. So yes, we may have a very clear process or discrete process of how we do something, but within each of those steps there's always tips and tricks, and that's that tacit knowledge that we want to gather and capture in these different areas. So to capture this tacit knowledge, what's the motivation? Why would I do that? Why would I want to help out? Well, other than it's, you know, probably part of your job to do that, but that in itself is not necessarily a motivation. How we find people are mostly motivated, why they want to participate, really kind of comes down to their legacy and being recognized for their contributions. So in the recognition category, oftentimes we'll add into a work instruction or a policy, or not a policy necessarily, but a procedure or an appendix to a document, where we've added these tips and tricks. We'll state who it's come from or cite who it's come from. It lends credibility to it from that senior person, but also provides us a little bit of public recognition for that person's contribution, for that legacy that they've shared with us, and that piece of knowledge. Contribution points, so a little bit fun, you know, could be a little bit cheesy, but at the same time fun. Concept of having contribution points. So every time a submission is made, maybe the individual gets some points, whether the contribution is accepted or not. And then over time, as their points accumulate, they would give out some small gifts, like a Starbucks card or something along those lines. And then also, and probably most important, is around performance reviews. So if it is part of their job, this is something that should start to show up in job descriptions. And as part of their annual or biannual performance review, it should be recognized if they've been a big contributor to the knowledge management system and to helping out the younger workforce get up to speed. So those types of recognition, if that activity is happening, is I think very valuable and is typically enough to make these programs work. But overall, is this enough? Well, good ideas are great, but it's the follow through what counts and what makes it legitimate, and what finishes off that level of motivation for people to continue to work with the program. So who's going to do this? Who's going to follow through on all these great ideas that come through, and how are you going to do that? Again, so one of the approaches that we've seen or people take, and again, we base this kind of off of our critical content solution, which is a very structured approach. Typically, throughout the course of the year, you're going to have a certain set of work instructions or procedures or standards that need to be reviewed and modified or changed. And we feel that's the perfect opportunity to insert some of these tips and tricks and pieces of tacit knowledge and record them in a way that are frequently read or used by individuals throughout the organization of all generations. So, for example, for a structured process, if we have a work instruction, as an example, that is due for review, that review will get submitted as just part of our everyday process, quality process, or safety progress program or compliance program that's already in place, and we'll get ready to review that. Well, over the course of that year, as these unstructured submissions come through, whether it's through an email or through a blog or through a variance request or all these different aspects that we identified earlier that this could come through, possibly using our tool, but simply using a spreadsheet as well, what you would want to do is queue those up so that you're not having to deal with every single one that comes through. You want to make sure the person who submitted it gets recognized and that they get notified that you've received their submission, but we typically want to put that into a queue for later. And as we go through the formal review of the document, or the work instruction in this case, we would then pull that from the queue and evaluate whether that's something that should belong into our document, or if there's some other medium where we could communicate that tip and trick or tacit knowledge. If it's not valid, then we may end up actually rejecting it, and maybe an opportunity for actual education as well, if it's really out there. But ideally, if we can incorporate those into our documents as part of our standard review process, that's one way to do that with very little extra work. Maybe a little bit of extra work, but not a whole lot more than what we're already doing. And so then we can then publish and communicate those changes out to the organization, just as part of our normal document control lifecycle. And so our tool, VERSAFILE Critical Content, helps to do that. But again, like I said earlier, you could incorporate this into whatever tool you're using today or whatever process you're using today. So where to get started? So typically, if you're involved or looking at something like this, we're assuming that there's some areas of high people change, and that could be as a result of retirement. It could be a result of a growth area in the company. Could be just a lot of transition happening in the organization as well. Where we also want to focus on is aligned with the business priorities. So If you want to align your program with what's important for the business and attach it to that and show how this adds value to that. And if it's not, it's going to be hard. It's going to be a real uphill battle. And then once you've gotten past those stages, then you want to start taking your business areas and categorizing them. We typically start at what's the highest risk to the organization, and then we go up the chain so that our lowest priority, our upside down pyramid, our lowest priority is actually number 5, general. Our highest priority is typically number 1, areas that are high risk. Then what's really strategic to the organization, what's high value, what's highly successful right now, because if it's successful and we have people retiring or eventually leaving, then we want to make sure we capture the information. And then once you've found those areas in the business, you don't have to capture everything, but you may again want to categorize the knowledge topics or the areas that you want to focus on within those business areas. And again, you could use this same hierarchy of needs to drive what areas you focus on. So we're getting close to end of time here, but here is an example of how RKO started to implement their program. We started with a few key people on the team and having the initiative in some of our processes. We do have a record retention program and a document control program. We did some communications around that and kind of loosely put in a framework around our master plan. And as implementing this, we went into each of our business units and selected a person from each business unit to focus on, to drive this. Started out with assessing what the needs were, and then making sure it was aligned, taking those needs and making sure that everyone was aligned with them, and then selecting an implementation strategy. It could be very, very simple, depending on the group, or depending on again on the group and the needs, it can become very advanced and sophisticated. And of course, as we went through this, we've continuously improved this and feed information back into the program for sustainment and improvements. So that's the end of our webinar. Just want to talk a little bit about VERSAFILE critical content. This is our document management, our document control system. Our goal here is to make document control easier and take some of the complexities and manual tasks out of it, help mitigate any kind of regulatory risk, reduce cycle times around document control reviews, and make sure that what we are delivering is accurate, complete, and consumable. Thank you again, everyone, for attending the session. And if other questions do come about, please feel free to email us or give us a call, and we'll be happy to answer those for you. Thank you.